Good evening, church family. Man, it's been a great day. We got to celebrate our seniors this morning, those that are graduating. Chase preached a great sermon this morning, good Bible classes. After church, me and my dad were able to go out and go disc golfing, and after we disc golfed, I just realized I'm about to say something that's going to get me in trouble with my kids. Me and Dad walked over to the carnival, and we had corn dog and lemonade. Y'all can get on to me when we get home, okay? Tonight, I'm kind of keeping with Paul's theme about the upside-down kingdom. I didn't want to steal his title, so I came up with this. We're going to talk about the servant kingdom. I want to start with a simple observation about how we tend to think. We're drawn to what is visible. We notice platforms, we notice influence, we notice people who seem to be up front, out front, or ahead. I'm thinking about world leaders, thinking about presidents, CEOs, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, guys like that, multi-billionaires. And without even realizing it, we begin to associate visibility with values. It's seen, so it must matter. If it's recognized, it must be important. If it's elevated, it's something that must be significant. But the kingdom of God doesn't operate that way. In fact, one of the first things Jesus does when he starts teaching about his kingdom is disrupt that entire way of thinking. He gives us a redefinition of the word greatness. He takes what we naturally believe about importance and he turns it upside down. In Matthew chapter 20, verses 26 and 28, it says, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." Church, that's not just a statement. That's an invitation into a completely different way of living. Because Jesus is saying, if you want to understand how my kingdom works, you have to let go of the assumption that you already have about greatness. You have to release the idea that importance is tied to being seen. You have to let go of the belief that the goal is to rise above others. Because Jesus says, in my kingdom, greatness is not about rising above. It's about lowering yourself in love. And that sounds good when we hear it, doesn't it? But whenever it meets our daily lives, it really challenges us. Because we live in a world that constantly pushes us in the opposite direction. A world that says, promote yourself. Build your image. Make sure people know what you're doing. Make sure that your contribution, that's recognized. And there's nothing inherently wrong with being known, but there's something deeply dangerous about needing to be known. Because the moment that recognition becomes your fuel, it begins to shape your choices. You start asking different questions. Not what is needed, but what's going to be noticed. Not where can I serve, but where will I be seen? And slowly, subtly, your motivation it begins to shift. And Jesus speaks directly into that tension in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1. He says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them." I want you to notice he doesn't say, don't do good things in front of people. That's not what he's saying. He says, don't do them for the purpose of being seen. That's a hard issue. Because you can do the right thing with the wrong motive and completely miss the point. You can serve and still be centered on yourself. You can give and still be driven by recognition. You can lead and still be building your own platform instead of reflecting God's heart. And the servant kingdom calls us out of that. It calls us into something deeper, something quieter, something that is more lasting. It calls us into faithfulness. Not flashy faithfulness, not occasional faithfulness, but steady, consistent, often unseen faithfulness. I want to take you back to a moment in the life of Jesus that captures this so clearly. Chase kind of tiptoed around it this morning in his sermon. I was back there saying, in John chapter 13, we find Jesus with his disciples at the table, and the scripture tells us that Jesus, he gets up, he removes his outer garment, wraps a towel around his waist, and he begins to wash the disciples' feet. Now, we've all heard this story, but don't let the familiarity go the way that it is. This is the Son of God. This is the one with all authority, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and he kneels. He takes the position of the lowest servant in the room. And he begins to do what no one else wanted to. And here's something worth noting. No one asked him to do it. There was no announcement. There was no setup. There was no moment where someone said, Jesus, will you demonstrate service to us? Nothing like that. He simply saw what was needed to be done, and he did it. That's what love does. It doesn't wait for recognition. It doesn't wait for instruction. It doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It responds. And as he moves from disciple to disciple, you can just imagine the tension in that room. Because this doesn't fit the disciples' expectations of who Jesus is. And when he comes to Peter resists. You remember what Peter said? He says, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus, you will never wash my feet. And underneath that statement is this idea that Peter had that Jesus, this is below you. And the way Jesus responds, it reframes everything. He tells Peter that unless he allows this, he has no part with him. In other words, you don't just need to learn how to serve, you need to learn how to receive my service. And that's where it begins for all of us. Because before we can live as servants, we have to understand what's been done for us, don't we? Jesus has already served you. He's already moved toward you, already given to you, already loved you at your worst. And at the cross is the ultimate expression of his love. Philippians 2 verse 8 says he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. That's the foundation of everything that we're talking about. We don't serve to earn God's love. We serve because we already have it. And when that settles in your heart, something that is forced, something that you have to do, and it just becomes something that flows. It flows out of you, it flows from your heart. But even then, we have to guard our motivation, because even good things can become distorted. So can we talk honestly for just a minute? There are ways of serving that are more visible, aren't there? Song leaders, leading a prayer, teaching, preaching, being in roles where people see you regularly. And those things, they matter. They are valuable, they're needed, they're part of how the body functions. But they come with a unique tension. Because, the more visible the role, the greater the temptation to kind of attach that to your identity, to who you are. And you begin to measure your worth by it, to depend on the feedback that comes from it. And if we're not careful, we start serving not from calling, but from craving. Craving affirmation, craving validation, craving recognition. And when that happens, there's something that shifts internally. You may still be doing the same things, but your heart's in a completely different place. And here's the truth that we have to come back to. Recognition cannot be your motivation. Not even in the visible world, especially in the visible worlds. Because if recognition is the motivation, and the moment recognition changes, your faithfulness will too. If the response is strong, you feel energized, you feel good about it, don't you, Paul? But if the response is quiet, you begin to feel discouraged. If someone else is celebrated, you begin to feel overlooked. And now your service is being shaped by people instead of being anchored in God. Colossians 3 and verse 23 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. That applies everywhere. On the stage, off the stage, in public, in private, in the moments that are seen and in the moments that are completely hidden. That matters. Because the consistency of your service is directly tied to the source of your motivation. If people are your source, your service is going to fluctuate. If God is your source, your service will be steady, and it will remain. Hebrews 6:10 reminds us, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown for him. God sees what others miss. He knows what you're doing in the hidden places of your life. He sees the preparation that no one applauds. He sees the sacrifice that no one mentions. He sees the consistency that is never highlighted. Nothing's wasted, nothing's overlooked, nothing is insignificant in his kingdom. And you know what that does? That frees you. It frees you to serve without pressure, to give without comparison, to stay faithful without needing attention. I want to bring this back down into everyday life again because most of life is not lived in the big, visible moments. It's lived in the small, repeated ones, isn't it? It's lived in how you respond when you're tired, how you treat people who can't do anything for you, how you act when there's no audience. That's where the servant kingdom is. Jesus says in Luke chapter 16 and verse 10, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. That means small moments are stepping stones. I'm sorry. Small moments are not stepping stones. Those are proving grounds, aren't they? They reveal who you're becoming. So when you choose patience instead of frustration, kids, I hope you're listening to me there right now. When you choose patience instead of frustration, that matters. When you help someone quietly, that matters. When you give without being known, that matters. Those are not small things. Those are kingdom things. And over time, those choices, they begin to shape your character. They train your heart to look more like Jesus. Now, let's talk about cost. Because real service always costs. If it doesn't cost you anything, it's probably convenience, not service. Service costs you time that you could have been using differently, energy that you may not have felt like giving, attention that you could have kept for yourself, and sometimes it does. It costs recognition. Sometimes you're going to do something meaningful and someone else will get the credit for it. Sometimes you'll give your best and no one's going to say anything. Sometimes you'll show up consistently and feel like no one notices. And in those moments, you're faced with a decision. You ask yourself the question, why am I doing this? And that question will do one of two things. That question will either expose frustration or it will reinforce Paul. Because if your answer is, I'm doing this so people will see me, those moments, they're going to drain you. But if your answer is, I'm doing this because I belong to God, those moments, they form you, they mold you, they will deepen you, they will anchor you. Jesus did not go to the cross to be recognized. Jesus was mocked, he was rejected, he was abandoned, and still, he chose obedience. Hebrews 12 and verse 2 says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. His motivation was not the responsibility. It was the will of the Father. And that's the invitation that's in front of us, to live lives that are not driven by applause, but by obedience. That are not sustained by recognition, but by relationship with God. So I want to ask you something very, very honestly. If no one ever noticed what you do, would you still do it? If no one ever thanked you, would you still serve with the same heart? If someone else received the credit for what you've done, would you still be faithful? Because those questions that they reveal what's really underneath. And listen to me, this is not about guilt. I'm not trying to guilt y'all into serving. That's not what we're doing here tonight. This is about alignment. You know, God is inviting us into something better, something more stable, something more free, more real. A life where you don't have to chase validation because you know who you already belong to. A life where you don't have to be seen because you're already known. A life where serving is not a strategy, but it's a reflection of who you're becoming. I heard a story earlier this week, and you'll have to forgive me if I butcher this, but I want you to travel back with me in time for a little bit. The late 1800s to the mid-1900s. Anybody remember what was going on at that time? About the 1890s and the 1950s? The polio epidemic. 1952, polio hit its peak. There were about 50,000 people diagnosed with polio. More than 3,000 of those people died, and 20,000 plus people were told, you're paralyzed, you're never going to walk. One of those people was a lady named Miss Gibbs. And there was one day she was at home and a preacher came by. He came in and sat down and they were talking with her. And he said, Miss Gibbs, I need to tell you something. He said, the church doesn't want you to come back. They're scared of the polio. I said, that's fine. I understand that. I said, preacher, would you do something for me? She said, would you pray that God finds something for me to do? This preacher looked at her and said, Miss Gibbs, you need to understand something. He said, God's done with you. Paralyzed, your wheelchair bound, there's nothing you can do. She said, preacher, she said, I may be extremely damaged goods, but God's not done. In fact, God likes these damaged goods, doesn't he? A few weeks go by, another preacher hears about this, and he stops in and says, Miss Gibbs, he says, I've got a really exciting opportunity for you. He said, we've got great Bible classes, but we don't have one for our children. He said, I'd like you to come in and head up our children's Bible school. I can do that. And you got two. She had a son and a daughter. So they start going to church. She heads up the Bible school program. And eventually it starts to grow, mostly because people are treating her like a sideshow. They want to see the lady with polio that's wheelchair bound teaching Bible classes. But she didn't care. The church was growing. The kids were coming. One night they're at home and she said, son, we got to do something for kids in the Bible school. She said, we're going to go down to that bus dealer and they're going to give us a bus. And he said, Mama, I don't think it works like that. So the next day they go down to this bus dealer and she meets the lady at the receptionist desk and she says, I need you to give me a bus. And the receptionist said, you mean you want to buy a bus? I said, no, I want you to give me one. And eventually the owner comes out and he says, Miss Gibbs, he said, I understand you want a bus. He said, you're going to have to buy it. They start having this exchange back and forth, and he looks at her and says, Mr. Gibbs, I can't do it. I can't give you a bus. And she said, I just want you to know God's going to be extremely disappointed with you. And they keep going back and forth, and finally God's working on this man's heart in real time. He said, Miss Gibbs, I don't know what's going on. He said, something is tearing me up on the inside. He said, you know what, this Sunday, he said, and for one Sunday only, he said, I'm going to give you a bus. And he looked at her and he said, but who's going to drive it? She said, I didn't really think about that. She said, I need a bus and a driver. He said, okay, one Sunday, I'll give you a bus and I'll give you a driver. And she said, Mister, she said, I'm sorry. She said, I was too scared to ask the first time, but there's two sides of town. Can I have two buses and two drivers? And he said, one Sunday, I'll give you two buses and two drivers. And that was the only Sunday that he gave her two buses and two drivers, because 2 years later, he was giving her 35 buses, 35 drivers, and they had over 5,000 children every Sunday. Lady was told that she couldn't do anything. We don't have to let that go. There's nothing I can do. As long as you've got air in your lungs, there's nothing that God can do with you.
Man.
So as we come to this moment, I want to turn this into an invitation. Not just to think differently, but to actually respond. Because, some of us, this message may have exposed something. Maybe you realize that recognition has been driving you more than you thought. Maybe you've been discouraged because you just feel unseen. Or maybe you stepped back from serving because you didn't feel appreciated. Or maybe you've been serving, but your heart's been divided, and tonight is an opportunity to realign. To say, God, I want to serve you from the right place. Not for attention, not for approval, not for recognition, but from love, from gratitude, from a heart that understands what you've already done for me. So as we stand and sing, I want to invite you, if this is something that you need to respond to come forward. Once again, our elders will step out into the aisle. Me and Paul Chase will be down here in the front. I don't want you to come forward just because anyone is watching, but because, God is working on your heart. You've got to come and say, God, reset my motivation. God, give me a servant's heart. God, help me to be faithful even when no one sees it. This is not a moment of recognition. It's a moment of direction, a decision to live life differently, a decision to embrace the servant kingdom that we've been talking about. Not just in words, but in the way that, we live our lives. So as we stand and as we sing, if God is stirring something up in you, I just ask, don't ignore it. Please come forward if the invitation is for you.